Hi everyone, this is Inside the Americas. Coming up, the FBI recoups millions of dollars in ransom money after last month's massive fuel pipeline attack. We'll look at what the U.S. is doing now to limit similar cyber attacks. Then in El Salvador, a woman finally released from jail after serving nearly a third of a 30-year prison sentence for violating the country's harsh ban on abortion. And as American tourists start to head into the EU, we'll follow a mini Statue of Liberty as she makes her way from France to her new home in Washington, D.C. I'm Jeannie Godula. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris made their first foreign trips as president and vice president this week. The VP has been tasked with finding the root causes of a spike in illegal migration via the southern border. Her trip took her to Mexico and Guatemala, where she bluntly told people not to come to the U.S. Joe Biden is now in Europe, where after a meeting with the British Prime Minister, he'll attend summits with the G7 and NATO before sitting down for some awkward conversations with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The FBI, meanwhile, says it has recouped most of the ransom money that was paid to a hacker group after it attacked a massive fuel pipeline. The internet criminals installed ransomware on the Colonial Pipeline in May and were paid over $4 million in cryptocurrency by the oil company to stop the attack. And while this was one of the biggest cyber attacks in the U.S., it's by far not the only one. Aaron Ogunkeyi explains.
For a first-of-its-kind operation, an undeniable success for the new ransomware task force in the United States, and one that could shake up the architecture of online extortion. Following a cyber attack on the operator of one of the country's largest fuel pipelines, U.S. authorities recovered most of the multi-million dollars in Bitcoin that had been paid in ransom.
We deprived a cybercriminal enterprise of the object of their activity, their financial proceeds and funding. For financially motivated cybercriminals, especially those presumably located overseas, cutting off access to revenue is one of the most impactful consequences we can impose.
Federal investigators followed the ransom as it moved through a labyrinth of at least 23 different accounts belonging to hacking collective DarkSide. A federal judge then permitted authorities to seize the funds from one of the accounts. Following a recent uptick in cyber attacks, the Biden administration has prioritized a more aggressive approach to fighting ransomware and to further examining how cryptocurrencies enable such crimes.
Ransomware and digital extortion pose a national security and an economic security threat to the United States. The Department of Justice, working with our partners, is committed to using all of our tools at our disposal to disrupt these networks.
The relevant government departments are set to coordinate anti-ransomware protocols similarly to the way they handle terrorism, while the Department of Homeland Security will soon require all pipeline companies to report significant cyber attacks. Officials have also announced the creation of 24-hour emergency centers to handle major hacking incidents.
Next now to El Salvador, where a woman sentenced to 3 decades in prison for abortion has been released after almost 9 years behind bars. As a 20-year-old student and 8 months pregnant, she slipped and fell while washing clothes. A court then found her guilty of aggravated homicide and sentenced her to 30 years in prison. El Salvador is socially conservative and devoutly Catholic and has one of the world's harshest abortion laws in the world. Valerie DeKimp explains.
When Sara Rogel was 8 months pregnant and she fell while doing the chores at home, she did what any other woman would have done: go to the hospital. That's where she was handcuffed and accused of having an abortion. At only 20 years old, she was sent to prison. Now, after nearly 9 years behind bars, she's finally free.
It was really difficult because an accident turned my life upside down. I loved my baby, and because of that accident, I lost my baby.
Rogel was released on Monday after her sentence was commuted to 10 years. She had initially been convicted to 30 years in jail after a court charged her with aggravated homicide. Her case is far from being isolated. In El Salvador, women can face 2 to 8 years in prison for having an abortion, and at least 30 years. They have been charged with manslaughter, homicide, or aggravated homicide. In recent years, several women who have had a miscarriage have been accused of committing those crimes. 16 women are currently in jail. Nearly 200 of them have been charged.
As long as women are imprisoned unfairly, as long as this type of law is still in place, we will remain one of the most backward countries in the world.
Last March, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights heard the case of Manuela, another woman sentenced to 30 years in prison after suffering an out-of-hospital birth. The Salvadoran government is being accused of committing violations against women's rights. The case could set a precedent in the continent.
Fighting broke out this week on the floor of Bolivia's legislative body. The fight pitted opposition politician Henry Romero against a member of the ruling Socialist Party, Antonio Colque, at issue Bolivia's roiling politics of recent years. In 2019, Bolivia's socialist president, Evo Morales, resigned in the face of widespread violent protests over allegations he fraudulently won the election while running for an unprecedented and unconstitutional fourth term. Over the past 10 years, the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico has lost over 12% of its inhabitants. Many of them are male workers who've taken off for the mainland in search of higher wages. That drain, plus increased government aid given to workers during the pandemic, has made it difficult for Puerto Rican farmers to find enough hands to help with their crops. They're now forced to bring in seasonal workers from Mexico and Honduras, as our team on the ground found out.
Moises takes great care of his coriander fields, but it's been a headache to find enough workers for the harvest. He says the blame lies with generous aid distributed by the U.S. government since the pandemic started.
With all this aid, people don't even want to work anymore. We put up ads, no one shows up, and if they come, they make no efforts.
But it's a problem that dates back years. In the last decade, 12% of Puerto Ricans have emigrated in search of qualified jobs. The island is emptying, and those who remain reject agricultural work. So Moises imported his labor force. Manuel comes from Chiapas, one of the poorest states in Mexico. He was able to send $1,000 back to his family after 2 months here, a sum he had never been able to earn before.
They are very happy. Now they can eat what we never had before.
Roberto has found a better quality of life here.
In Mexico, I had to work 10 or 12 hours a day, and I was only paid 120 Mexican pesos.
The equivalent of $6, that's less than what he earns in an hour here.
If I could bring my wife and children here, I would do it without hesitation. I see a better future for us here in Puerto Rico.
Moises' 9 Mexican employees will return home in 3 months, but they will definitely be back for the next season. These exchanges are possible thanks to the H-2A temporary job program set up by Washington. Puerto Rico needs 1,500 foreign farm workers to support its limited agricultural sector.
The most important thing is that we grow our farming sector, because in Puerto Rico it's a sector that represents barely 3% of the economy. And if we have to resort to foreign labor for that, let's do it.
On this other farm, this program has not yet been used, but according to its director, it will be inevitable in the near future.
It's been a year and a half since it became very hard to find employees. I stopped farming about 60 acres of land because of lack of manpower.
A reduction in cultivated land is a problem for an island which produces only 15% of the food it needs, and which spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year importing the rest.
American tourists got some good news this week as the U.S. lifted travel warnings on dozens of countries around the world. Those include Japan, the site of this year's Summer Olympics. The CDC, the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, lowered some 60 countries from the highest level 4 rating to a level 3 rating that recommends travel if you're fully vaccinated. France is on that level 3 list as well. Restrictions on another 50 countries were lowered even further, including Singapore and Israel. And speaking of traveling, one very famous Iron Lady is making her way now to the United States. But this Statue of Liberty is a smaller version of the famous one in New York. She usually lives here in Paris, but is now crossing the Atlantic as a gift from France to the U.S., just like her big sister before her.
She's getting ready to set sail for New York, where she's off to join her big sister.
There are cobwebs in the cracks. I can't quite reach them.
This replica of the Statue of Liberty is usually in front of the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris. For the next 10 years, it will have a new home, on loan to the US as a gift from France.
Parisians won't see her for a few years, but she'll come back one day, and in the meantime, Americans will get to see her.
The replica will leave Paris for Le Havre on France's northern coast, where it will be transported by boat to New York. A delicate operation that requires a lot of caution.
We've got to be especially careful with the crown and the torch. There's a risk the statue will touch something. It won't be in its usual position, so there'll be less balance, and that's where we have to be careful.
The replica will travel across the Atlantic, retracing the same journey the original Statue of Liberty made 135 years ago, when it was given to New York as a gift from France. The loan marks a renewal of the long-standing bonds between the two countries.
The statue was created to celebrate the independence of the United States, and now it's also a tribute to the Franco-American friendship.
Measuring just short of 3 meters, the replica is 16 times smaller than the original in New York. The grand arrival is set for the 4th of July, in time for Independence Day celebrations, before heading to Washington, where it will be displayed at the French Embassy.
That wraps it up for this edition. Thanks so much for watching Inside the Americas. We'll see you next time for all the news from north to south.
Scarce resources, little to no recognition, and a succession of natural disasters have driven many of Puerto Rico's citizens to the breaking point.
Pero el resto de la familia, incluyendo mis hijos, está fuera de Puerto Rico, está en Estados Unidos. Estoy recibiendo algunos 961, creo que es que me sobra.
While Joe Biden's presidential win has given some people hope.
Y para mí es mucho mejor el que tengamos todos los derechos que tienen los ciudadanos americanos.
Others remain skeptical about the country's future.
O debemos independizarnos.
Puerto Rico, treading waters, on France 24 and France24.com.